Before we begin, I first want to thank Jake and Chris and Karen for putting on such a great conference here locally in the Richmond area. I've been coming for quite a few years, and I feel like every year it gets a little bit better. Things run a little bit better, smoothly. So I'm just honored to be a part of it this year. So as the title suggests, we're going to talk about zero trust today, and kind of my take on it. That's kind of the light side of it, my opinion of how to do it, problems I've seen the customers run into. So before we really dive into the material, let's get the housekeeping stuff out of the way. The opinions are my own. They're not my employer. So if I misspeak, blame me, not my employer. About me, I've been in this industry for a little over 10 years now. I started my career in Southwest Virginia working for the Army, and I've worked at a couple of the places here in Richmond. I've had the privilege to work for Genworth Financial, Dominion Energy, a little company out of the Virginia Beach, ABS Technology. I'm currently a client solutions architect at Optiv. So here's what we're going to cover today. Before we really start talking about zero trust and what zero trust is and everything that I want to share as far as my opinion with zero trust, I kind of want to set the groundwork of what has been done in the past and why you kind of need a new way of thinking about how we design our networks. And that's really where we're going to talk about the three-tier architectures. Then we'll talk about who really came up, coined the term zero trust, where it came from. I want to cover some of the key terms as far as what zero trust does. We'll look at a topology of what a zero trust network looks like. And then we'll try to change gears into the more of the opinion part of the conversation. Challenges that I see with zero trust and then that I've seen customers kind of run into, as well as my suggestions on how to successfully embrace zero trust architecture. So like I said, let's take it back. Three-tier architecture. This is something that you all should have seen at some point in your careers. You may already have an environment that's still set up this way. You likely do. Pretty straightforward stuff. We have our presentation layer, our application layer, and our database layer, right? So the presentation layer, that's what's actually presenting content out to the end users. That's your web servers, if you will. They make calls into the actual computational layer, the application layer that's going to be manipulating the data, and that data is coming from your database layer. That's pretty straightforward stuff. Again, we should have all seen that. You probably can't see this date here, but that says May 2004. I'm sure this was been done well before that, but that was the oldest artifact I could find just quickly Googling out there, three-tier architecture. Right, so what I'm trying to suggest is that this is antiquated in the way we think about things, that it hasn't kept up with the threat landscape. Oh, sorry here. I think we overheated our projector. She did. Yeah! Yeah! Good presentation. All right, while he's getting that back up, I can still speak to three-tier architecture. So it just really hasn't kept pace with our needs as far as the security landscape as well as application design. All right, and we're going to touch on that. And are we coming back up, guys, back there? Maybe? We'll have to go through like the reboot cycle. This is what happens when you get hackers in a room, People start monkeying with stuff. I hear something happening. I guess if you talk for so long, everything goes to sleep, even projectors. So, so I'll just continue on here, but so what I'm saying there with the threat landscape, just diving that a little bit more before I go into the next slides. The threats we faced back in 2004 are very different than the threats we face today. I don't think anyone will argue that. And, we're going to go into some details there and some examples of what I mean by that. And then when I start talking about the application side, the changes that we've kind of faced over the years there is the computational power of machines of the end users, right? So there's more and more of this application kind of computational changes being done in the browser itself. It's the old way of thinking that you must have a presentation layer, you must have an application layer, and you must have a database layer is getting very much blended, especially between the web layer and the application layer. That's just the nature of more power and computing in the web side of things. So this model doesn't really fit that as well, just from, again, the nature of web design. We got a little light here, it's kind of warming up. I can see it, it's thinking about it. It wants to play nicely. Gotta love it. Yay! Hooray for the VCU team. All right, so the reason I didn't want to go to the next slide is because I wanted to talk about what those threat landscapes look like in 2004, right? You may be protecting against something like this. Actually, I'm kidding. I have no idea if you could rickroll someone in 2004, but I put this slide in there just so I could say I rickrolled the entire RVAsec audience. All right. Means the projector spoiled my thunder. Now, I'm back on track here. So this really is an example of an attack from 2004. This is Microsoft, obviously, and I would chalk this up to cyber graffiti, right? That was really a big deal back in the early 2000 era. Someone goes through and changes a couple things to your website. Yes, you lost credibility. Yes, it hits the front page of the newspaper. But what was the financial impact compared to what some of the sinister attacks we see today? Pales in comparison. It's really no comparison to what the millions of records that we see stolen day in, day out in recent history. So to dive in a little more of the ThreeTier architecture on where the challenges really are lying with this topology, the first thing that comes to my mind when you look at this, and again, this should look pretty common layout for everybody. You should have seen something like this in your experience. We have outside user, we have our web tier, our app tier, and our database tier with everything playing nicely here in this trusted environment, right? This is our nice trusted core where everything is trusted because it's internal. And we have some type of third-party access typically where, for whatever business function they need to get inside of our trusted network for whatever data purposes, right? Pretty common layout. I've seen this time and time again with customers. So the first problem I see with this topology is your internal LAN, right? Wild, Wild West. We have no visibility there. And even if we did have visibility, what in the heck are we going to do to control it if we wanted to? The controls are not built there. We're built here in the perimeter with all of our investments we made to build our outside nice, hard shell. The next thing that kind of comes to mind, in my opinion anyway, is the cloud. I drew it rainy for a reason because, it does cause challenges, right? As it becomes more and more prevalent and more acceptable in the industry to start putting data out there, you're starting to see, at least I'm starting to see in the industry, of more PCI data moving out there, more HIPAA data. It's just the nature of the beast. Those systems, they're economies of scale. It just happens. More of that data is moving outside of our perimeter. Again, we've spent lots of money here on our perimeter. It's hard to really protect data that's left our perimeter with our current defenses, right? That's a challenge. Looking at this diagram, if you were to ask the ex-CIO or the ex-CEO, I say X for a reason, of Target, they look at this diagram, they'd say, well, the challenge here is Mr. Robot's hanging out in your third-party environment, right? In the recent past, we've seen a lot of that take place as well. Third-party environments are just as dangerous as this Wild, Wild West because as soon as they're allowed in here and we don't have visibility of what they're doing, that's been a common occurrence of breaches taking place through third-party environments. Lastly, I'll just kind of touch on it, BYOD. I know some of you guys have embraced it, some of you probably haven't, but it's becoming more and more of a trend, and it's certainly not helping our security posture by having machines on our network that aren't to the same standard as our corporate-owned machines. So to put that all in writing here, like I said, we have limited visibility in our network, we have limited control options. I didn't touch on that third point, but a lot of times we're relying on antiquated technologies, so our firewall rules are built as network 1 can get to network 2 over port XYZ, right? We need to get out of that way of thinking. We need to start talking about business alignment. AD group of finance can get to the finance systems over finance protocols, right? So we need to get away from this whole antiquated subnet to subnet stuff. I see it all the time, so I know a lot of us are still guilty of those policies kind of hanging out in our environment where we're not really practicing least privilege like we should be. All right, like I already touched on, the application designs are much different than they've been in the past. Like we're starting to move more to a blended model between especially our web tier and our app tier. And I touched on cloud as it moves outside of your environment, it's hard to control. BYOD is an issue as well as third party. So here's kind of, I'm not going to say it's the answer to all of our problems, but it is an answer. Who here has heard of Zero Trust or read any of the Forrester papers? All right, so a couple of you have, right? So you've probably heard then of John Kindervag. He's the one that I give all the credit to as far as coming up with this stuff. He was a principal analyst at Forrester Research. He's moved on since. He's now the field CTO for Palo Alto Networks. But yeah, very forward-looking guy that put this stuff in writing back in 2010. I actually spoke with John Kindervag, run through this presentation with him and kind of get his ideas on what I'm missing, what I'm not. And he was very approachable, so if you're thinking about taking this kind of model on, I'd suggest you reach out to him. He was super nice guy. Anyway, back to the point, he published this in 2010, so roughly 7 years ago. When he wrote this document, some of the hardware didn't even exist to be able to put this stuff in place. So that's why I kind of look at him as a forward thinker, because things that he's kind of put out there are still being implemented today, and they still hold true. Here's his talk. The title of it, "No Chewy Centers Introducing Zero Trust Model." And again, pay note to that date, 2010. So this is a excerpt from that document, and I thought this was interesting. In 2010, when he published that, this kind of drew my attention. There's 30,000 identities. He's talking about an attack from Philip Cummings. A guy sold a bunch of credit reports. He sold them from Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, the credit agencies. He was working for a broker, right? And this guy harvested 30,000 credentials and sold them out in the black market. And it's funny, that was the biggest identity theft in U.S. history at the time. To kind of put that in perspective since then, I won't run through all these just for sake of time, but you see like Yahoo, 500 million, eBay, 145 million, LinkedIn, 117 million, PlayStation, 77 million. You get the point. The level of magnitude of threat we're facing now, and again, the sinister level of what they're actually looking for, it's a financial impact now versus just a bunch of script kiddies trying to change a couple of words on your front website. This is very financially driven stuff, and we need to really think about how we protect it and get out of the mode of thinking of years past. I just don't think it's keeping up. So zero trust, what it actually means. Now we've kind of beat up the dire situation that we're in. At a very, very, very high level, zero trust is just like the name implies. You're not trusting segments on your network. So it's more of a trust, untrust. It's funny. Any of you guys have been in this industry for any time at all, and you probably remember like security devices used to ship with actually labeled interfaces, labeled trust etched into the thing. Even a lot of the enterprise-grade material today is shipping with zones that are pre-labeled trust and untrust. So we certainly haven't gotten out of this idea of trusted segments on our network. It's very prevalent today, and we need to get away from that, as what John argues, and I tend to agree with him. So the fundamentals, this is straight out of the Forrester paper, so this isn't in my opinion, but all resources are accessed in a secure manner regardless of location. Pretty straightforward stuff, best practice. We've all been practicing that for a while now. Access controls on a need-to-know basis, strictly enforced. Again, best practice. I don't know how well we do it, but best practice. Verify, never trust. That's kind of getting out of the scope of where I'd say that most people kind of really adapt. And this next one I pay particular close attention to because I think a lot of people breeze over that, but I look at that as a pretty dramatic shift in thinking. Inspect and log all traffic. That's a big one. In my experience, that's not really common. That's not the way people really handle their environments. Network design from inside out, I'll show you what that's that's more of a theoretical thing, but it's certainly, when you look at zero trust, the purest, it is from the inside out. I want to run through the terminology just because, again, if you deal with any of the papers, people that are actually working off of the papers themselves, they use some terminology that may not make sense at face value. So I'll go through these quickly because I go into more depth in later slides. Segmentation gateway, that's more or less a next-gen firewall. All right, micro core and perimeter, MCAP, that's a DMZ kind of on steroids. Data acquisition network, the DAN, that's where all your logging is sent to. That's a logging area. Management server, we all have an idea what a management server is in our head, but it may not tie directly to what Forrester kind of laid them out as. And that's a separate area of your network that may have a management server or servers to be the backplane management of all of your devices and your separate MCAPs. Right? Okay, so segmentation gateways. I said they were just next-gen firewalls. At the time he wrote this, they didn't have really appliances that were sold to market that could really meet this need. So that's why I was very forward-looking back in 2010. But today, that's not the case. All the enterprise carriers of next-gen firewalls will support this need. So they need to be able to do the IPS, IDS, application identity, layer 7 firewalling, malware detection. You get it. The SSL decryption, and they also need to be spec'd to handle very, very high throughput. And you'll see why as you see where this thing is located, right in the core of your network. And I've put a couple of vendors here that would fit that need. You have Palo Alto there, Checkpoint, and Fortinet. And all the chassis I have displayed there support roughly 100 gigabit per second with the features turned on. So in years past, the idea you couldn't put something in the core of your network because you didn't want to slow everything down because it didn't have the capacity to do it anyway, right? Well, that's not the case anymore. The security vendors have done a very good job of really meeting that demand and providing products that will, I would say there's maybe some people in the audience that would still struggle with it, but it may be one or two here. I doubt many people would have trouble with 100 gigabit in their core, right? And the last couple bullets there, since I'm running out of time, I want to make sure I speed up here. It just needs to integrate with all your other tools. That's what that's getting at. Micro core and micro perimeter. Again, I said that's a DMZ kind of on steroids. But at its heart, the way it's different than what you may be thinking of the traditional web app database kind of model. Every interface off of that core segmentation gateway is its own MCAP, right? Because I kind of wrap your head around that. Every interface off of that core device is its own MCAP. Therefore, what you've done is you've created these layer 2 switching domains where there's no ability for cross-pollination between your different MCAPs except through your segmentation gateway. So you're physically isolating these layer 2 switching domains, right? Hope you're following along. And like it says, another big difference there is how they're broken out. They need to be aligned with business functionality as well as global security policy. So if they meet those criteria, they can kind of be in the same MCAP. If not, they should be in a separate MCAP. And you'll see why as I kind of go through. So they can be, again, much more specific than traditional just web app DB. The DAN, as we said, that's where all your logins go on. So it's a separate, think about it as a separate MCAP. And how that is actually architected or actually deployed is now that we have this, again, I can't repeat it enough, segmentation gateway right in the core. It has all the visibility of all your different flows going through it. So it has visibility from your outside connections coming in. It has that visibility from all your user segments that are going out. It has all the visibility from your hosted segments because it's all off of this center core device. All the traffic from each of those interfaces need to be mirrored down to your DAN. And inside of your DAN, what you're going to have in there is your SIMs, your packet capturing tools, any of your SOC tools, that kind of stuff. And the idea there is that they become much more powerful with the additional logging that they're going to collect. Right? Currently, most environments, they have firewalls in their DMZs or patched here and there just as security needs it, whereas this is right in the core. It's seeing everything. And it's a one-stop shop to be able to really chew on your logs. And if it's done properly, like that bottom bullet says there, it should enable quicker timed resolutions, right? So, and that's not even security problems. That's just your application guy calls up and says, no ticky, no talkie, no worky kind of thing. Well, now your operations guys have a one-stop shop to be able to look at that stuff. It should be quicker. Saying, where's the communication breakdown at? Because I have a one-stop shop to look at all the communication flows in my network, as well as event discovery, right? So your SIMs become more powerful because they do have access to your internal logging. It's not just relying on your external edge to be able to gather the data of what's happening security-wise. All right, so let's look at the actual network design and how it's actually, we'll look at it, for the network geeks in the room. This is the part you've been waiting for. This is your segmentation gateway. You probably can't read that, but it says firewall, IPS, application control, crypto. You get the idea. Next-gen firewall. Here's your outside connections coming in, so your users. They're obviously going to be connected in through your segmentation gateway. Here's all your LAN segments, and this is at a minimum, I would suggest, breaking it out this way. Your wireless, your LAN connected, and your third-party users. There's certainly, you could take this to the X degree. There's certainly some architectures out there that suggest micro-segmentation to user level. Always on VPNs, a pretty common solution there to break that out even further. Talk about management MCAP, and that's going to be your backplane to manage all your devices, your DAN for logging, and then your traditional hosted subnets. And I wrote it as www web, so application database. But this, as I said, this would be many MCAPs, many application MCAPs, many database MCAPs, as your business defines, right? It's going to be very unique because these are very much tied to business alignment and the functionalities in your business and the security controls that should be around those. So now we've kind of laid it out there. What is Zero Trust? In a nutshell, as quick as I could, kind of go through what Forrester laid it out to be. So now I kind of want to touch on, is this even so relevant? This was written back in 2010, so I mean, surely this has kind of fell by the wayside, or you have seen more traction since then. And I would say it's just now starting to really pick up steam, as I'm just now starting to see customers really starting to leverage this stuff. Here's the first example I'm going to use. It's from the House Oversight Committee. And this is kind of a big deal because they don't really stand behind anything except their own models, right? They stand behind NIST. You hear them talk about that every now and then. But this is the first time I've ever heard of government really backing any type of framework, really. And I like the title, by the way. I wish I could get by with reports like this. How the government jeopardized our national security for more than a generation. Lovely. So this was a report that the House Oversight Committee produced after the OPM breaches. I would suspect most of you guys remember that or have heard about it at least. Anyone that has a security clearance, you definitely heard about it because now your information's out there. What they did is they gathered data from OPM of the SF-86s. And for those that have never been through this clearance process, one, I say lucky you. Two, it's a big deal because in that SF-86, it's going to have your socials, it's going to have all your addresses you've lived at, your acquaintances. It's even going to have stuff like your drug usage and have mental health kind of stuff, just stuff you don't want out in the public, right? And that's what was lost with all these OPM records, SF-86 on these breaches. So it was a really big deal. And the House Oversight Committee, they came up with recommendations, post-breach analysis kind of thing. And it was 13 recommendations in total. And the one you see here on the slide, you'll see that it's recommendation number 2. And it came only behind ensure agency CIOs are empowered, accountable, and competent. So the bar is set pretty daggone high. You're saying people that run your shop never really know what they're doing. And then next, you need to make sure you start doing a zero trust model. So it was a big deal. And it goes on to kind of say here, I can kind of read this quickly. I don't think I'm too far behind. But it says the OMB, which is the Office of Management Budget, should provide guidance to agencies to promote zero trust IT security model. The OPM data breaches discovered in 2014 and 15 illustrate the challenge of securing large and therefore high-value data repositories when defenses are geared towards perimeter defenses, like we just talked about. In both cases, the attackers compromised user credentials to gain initial network access, utilized tactics to elevate their privileges, and once inside the perimeter were able to move throughout OPM's network and ultimately access the crown jewel data held by OPM. The agency was unable to visualize and log network traffic, like we just talked about. It's a big problem. To combat the advanced persistent threats seeking to compromise or exploit federal government IT networks, agencies should move towards a zero trust model of information security and IT architecture. That's a big deal. It's not talking about OPM should do that. It's saying all federal IT systems should embrace this. I don't know if you can wrap your head around that, but if you've been following the news, President Trump, like him or hate him, he just signed an executive order with cybersecurity stuff. I can promise you, you're going to see more zero trust. This is one of the artifacts they're using in those committees, right? It's coming. So, but you may be out in the crowd saying, you know what, federal government is probably the last person I'd look to for as forward-looking for IT security. I'm not taking their advice, right? So how about Google? Who's here heard of the BYOD Corp stuff, right? Any of the ISSA members, I missed a talk the other night, but I think on Tuesday they had a talk on BYOD Corp here in Richmond. So this is off their webpage, right out of their description. BYOD Corp is an enterprise security model that builds upon 6 years of building zero trust networks at Google. They've been embracing this stuff for a while now. You know, they've kind of made their own little spin-off of it, but the point is, this stuff is happening, and I see it more and more picking up in the industry. It's here to stay, in my opinion. All right, so now we really start getting into the opinion part of the talk on what I've seen in the industry, on folks that have tried to embrace it, and just challenge that I see with it. So at face value, probably the obvious thing there is time and money, right? We've all made huge investments to where we've gotten today in our current security posture. It's kind of daunting to think about changing all that around. So it's definitely a challenge and something to be thought about. Virtualization, so it does add complexity, but it's nothing that can't be taken, control with like NSX, with like some of the micro segmentation features that are there. We can certainly break those systems out, send them through a segmentation gateway, and then send them back on their merry way and still leverage virtualization technologies, right? So it's a challenge nonetheless, but you just got to think about it. And the last ones here, I'll kind of run through them quickly, but they're more of just, you may not be set up to handle, whether it be the logging capabilities, that's going to be increased with having all those logs in your core being gathered, or your network may not be able to support having all that traffic sent back to one spot. You may not have the port density, you may not have the port capacity, what have you. You may have to have issues there, and that can be both time and money as well. Just things to think about. So my suggestions on how to kind of successfully embrace this kind of methodology, I'll run through these quickly because I go through each of these in more detail, but first you need to start by classifying your data, right? If you haven't already, and I feel like we as security engineers, and frankly businesses in general, really suck at that. That's some area that I just feel like, just seeing across the board, we're not very good at, or we just don't dedicate the time that's needed because it is a very difficult process. After we kind of identify, where our business levels of criticality and where our data at rest kind of lie of what we need to protect as far as the server, where it lives, we need to start identifying the data flows, right? After we do, while we do those first two, these next two can be kind of done in parallel, but we need to start thinking about our log analysis tools to ensure that they can support the capacity, right? Is there going to be additional log flows? Probably will be. Are we ready to support that level of additional log flows? And then we should be also thinking about user identification strategy. If you don't already have a user identification strategy, some of you have fully embraced it, but again, we need to get away from that antiquated technology of subnet A can go to subnet B, and while we're really revamping our network, please don't go put those rules back into a nice new design. The last thing you want to see is the garbage that's coming out go right back into your system, because you really want to practice this idea of least privileges, and leveraging your AD environments are a really good way of doing that. And then after you kind of do the groundwork, it's time to deploy your segmentation gateway. I argue that you should start with your most critical systems first, just for your biggest bang for your buck, and kind of work down the list. And that's kind of where the Lite comes in. Because I look at Zero Trust as an evolutionary process. There's no reason this thing can't live with your current environment. It's a process. It should be a project each time you kind of run through a new MCAP, but every time you do that, I feel like your security posture raises a little bit more. So just start somewhere. You don't have to embrace this full thing and have everything ripped and replaced, and you now embrace Zero Trust. This is the kind of the way that I see getting there, the evolutionary period. And then obviously that kind of a maintenance item there at the bottom. Any new system that you have should certainly go in behind your new environment if you choose to, again, embrace Zero Trust. So I said first step, classify your data. Forrester has their own little paper on just that. So I've already used them, so I'll use them again. They suggest using the model of unclassed, toxic, and radioactive. I say it doesn't matter what you call it, and it doesn't even have to be 3 tiers, but it needs to be 2 things, in my opinion. It needs to be aligned to business need. So if that data is lost, how's it going to affect the business? That's how you determine the actual price value of that said data, as well as there needs to be strictly defined on how you protect that level of data. So just you classifying what data is only half the battle. You still need to identify what you're going to do differently with that data and how you're going to secure it. Example kind of there, if you use this scale and use radioactive, maybe you'd say, that is our PCI defined data, and that PCI data, you can only access it if you're 2-factor auth and you re-auth every 30 minutes. You can only be accessed by Active Directory group A, B, and C. Unclassed data that can be accessed by anybody, even maybe our third-party contractors. You get the point. It needs to be very, very explicitly defined, and it's a very tough step. I get it, but you got to do it. There's tools out there to help, like I said here on the slide, that will scan your network looking for different syntax strings to kind of find where that data lives. But at the end of the day, it's going to suck. It's hard work. It takes a while, but it's very necessary to do this properly. And then, it's kind of obvious, but after you go through all this effort, make sure you update your policies and your training to reflect what you just came up with, because as data is being created, you want your users to kind of abide what you come up with. Don't do this in a vacuum, with your security group to say, yeah, we're done, we classified it all, and then all your user groups are making data left and right. You had to go back and then do the pull process again. So make sure You align your training to this and make sure everyone's in the fold with what you're doing with data classification. So then I said identify the data flows, right? So we know where the data is at rest. We've classified it nicely. We know where our toxic or radioactive data is. Well, when does that data become toxic? When does it become radioactive? Are there parts that come together? Does it bounce across multiple servers? Because just if we see it at rest, we still need to understand what that flow looks like. Because we want to understand where the points of compromise are. Just because, again, we got it at rest, it still could be compromised in flight, right? So really need to look at our flows. And that process, it acts as twofold. One, you should know this stuff. It's a good thing to have as far as knowing how your business works. You'd be shocked at how many people have no idea how their business works once you start pulling back the covers. But it also is a great exercise to start building the blueprints for your MCAPs, right? Because there's going to have to be some time where you sit down and say, how am I going to break these different little zones out? Well, as you start identifying the different levels of classification and you start identifying the flows, you know what level every server is along the way. It becomes much simpler than to say, well, these servers belong together because they have the same security posture, they have the same business functionality. Right? Does that make sense? I hope so. Prepare your DAN tool sets. Make sure you don't overload them. There's nothing worse than getting the stuff all laid out, and you make the investment on your segmentation gateway, and it puts you in a worse visibility spot than where you before because you just burnt down your SIM. Because you ran out of license or whatever, and now you have blind spots that you could have been accounted for. So think about what that logging is going to look like. You're going to be capturing internal flows now, your user segments. I would argue they're the chattiest segments by far on your network. And if you're not capturing them now, that's going to really up the logs per second or however you're paying for your logging utilities. Right, so think about that. You need to plan for it. And obviously upgrade or acquire tools as necessary. And I tie this in, and this is definitely my opinion. This has nothing to do with the zero trust stuff. But, man, I can't tell you how big of a deal this is when it comes to reducing your operational overhead. It looks like a big job up front to kind of move away from those antiquated, again, the subnet, port 123. It is. It's a big step up front to kind of really lock that down to least privilege, but the operational overhead reduction, once it's in place, you can't speak too highly of it. I mean, because as users inside your environment start moving around, Susie moves from HR to finance or whatever, as long as the AD groups are kept up in the back end, your network security guys don't touch a thing. It reduces their job. It's all about trying to tie your security posture to the business. Because at the end of the day, that's what we need to get in the way of thinking. Instead of thinking technically, we need to think with the business. That's where we need to do a better job as IT security professionals. So implement this if you don't already. Again, we don't want crap coming out, crap coming in kind of thing. We want to really do it right. So implement user identity, and there's lots of ways of capturing that stuff. I'm sure you have already well aware of that. So now we're ready to actually do the tactical thing of deploying of this new segmentation gateway in our core. As I said, start with your most critical areas. You kind of scratch your head, maybe, well, why would you start with your most critical? Well, if you're going to do it, you kind of want the biggest bang for your buck as you start putting these most critical areas back there. Your security posture, I say, jumps higher than in your lower kind of threshold of data that you want to put back there. And work down that list. And I would recommend, and this is, I see too many people that I've signed, try to help with this. Don't try to eat the elephant. Treat each of them as their own separate project. Start small. We've all deployed firewalls. We get it. Use the same things we've always done. Put the MCAP out there. Let it run in any rule for a while, and it's logging. Because at this point, your DAN is in place, right? You're getting some really, really robust logging at this point. There's no reason this thing can't run for a week or so, and you really get an idea of what that data should look like, what those applications are running on that system, and just start applying policies just like you've probably always done when you've changed out firewalls. Pick a time to remove that any rule. Bam, you're up and running. Rinse and repeat for the rest of the systems on that list that you came up with. And that's how you ultimately get to the mature life cycle of zero trust environment. Hope that makes sense. And obviously, continue to reassess your MCAP and business alignment. I keep harping on everything should be tied back to the business because I think that's a real big change in mind shift for security professionals. We've always kind of done our own thing and told the business to follow us. It needs to be the opposite. We need to be aligned with what they need out of us. We are the ones that are certainly helping the business to be better at what they do. So annual review, biannually, whatever makes sense for your company. But as data changes, as applications change, as the type of data we collect, what have you, it's a natural thing that our data and our systems are going to change inside of our environments. So run through and make sure that they're still aligned. We don't want radioactive data living with unclassified data systems. That stuff can change overnight. You may take a new system that's taking in credit card data or whatever. Stay on top of that, because as you do this recurring process of making sure your business is aligned with your MCAPs, the goal here is kind of that bottom bullet here. As future compliance requirements come down the line, you become much more agile to react to them. An example there, if you have all your, I've already used PCI, so maybe you have your HIPAA data in one little area and broken out in different MCAPs for business needs. New HIPAA requirement comes down. If the segmentation gateway can support it, it's as easy as clicking a button and turning it on. And it's no trying to reduce scope and trying to find out what's where. It's already done for you. It's already in a nice encapsulated environment. If the segmentation gateway doesn't support it, it's as easy as putting on that layer 2 segment, because it's already nice and isolated through the nature of the design of zero trust, right? That's the idea in a perfect world. So final thoughts. Trust will always be exploited. We've seen that time and time again in the recent past. A trusted user segment becomes very untrusted as soon as you have a rogue user or the insider threat, right? And there's been a lot of very financially impactful examples of that in the recent past. Same with trusted third-party users, like I've said. Lots of examples of there. Beat that one up pretty good. It's not a silver bullet, so I'm not up here telling you that if you do this and you go full in and you're mature in your zero trust environment, you'll never have to worry about exploits or data being leaked, that kind of stuff. But what I would argue is you're going to be a better state than if you kind of follow the status quo. And I've already said this, but it's very much a theoretical end state. You can always be breaking this stuff out and continue to split out and segment your environments to where there's really is zero trust inside your environment. But it's really kind of trying to balance the risk appetite of your organization on how far you want to take this zero trust mentality, right? And at the end of the day, what this thing should kind of yield for you is that it should yield a higher security posture. And what we mean by that is, again, visibility inside your networks, ability to control all that kind of stuff, and less operational overhead. And what we're really driving on there is that, with less touch points, because make no mistake, you're reducing your firewall count and that kind of stuff, and you're kind of wrapping in the technologies of Active Directory, user identity, that kind of stuff. You should have less operational overhead as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds after you kind of get to a mature state, right? And with that, are there any questions? Or do we have time? We have time. Yeah, I burnt through that. I thought our projector was going to kill us, so that's the fastest I've ever went through a presentation. Yes, sir. Yes, so the question was, do I see it integrated with user behavior type stuff? So the closest I would say to yes to that is if you look into that BYOD Corp model that I was referencing of Google, they have some of that. So the BYOD Corp stuff is very much trying to rely on trying to figure out what the device is that's coming into the environment. A lot of intelligence there. Trying to identify who that user is to build policies around identifying what's there. Now, probably not the level of intelligence you're thinking of. But that's about the gist that I've seen. BYOD Corp, I mean, you can look into their stuff. It's the white papers are out there on that site that I listed. Any other questions before we drink some beer? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly, I mean, I would say there's going to be some rework there, right? If you don't have a gateway in your core that's going to be able to support the end state, there's obviously at some point going to be a rip and replace when you run out of capacity. But I mean, you could certainly do what I've just laid out here on your stepped approach by taking an MCAP and put it in behind there, taking your next MCAP, put it behind there, with a smaller device, maybe an extra device you have on hand, something that maybe not can support your entire environment. But at some point, you're going to hit a point where that's no longer going to be able to support the entire throughput, and you're going to have to do a rip and replace, and there's a little bit of rework there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? And if there aren't any other questions, I'll be at the Opta booth tomorrow, so any guys want to come by and just ask me one-on-one, that's fine too. Thanks.